Who would win between Who and Ha? The longest posed question among comic book readers and superhero movie fans in history. Who doesn't like geek fantasy booking their own hero versus hero or villain versus villain fights? And it just so happens that in this video, we'll be doing the latter.
You're about to become whole again.
Kang the Conqueror and the High Evolutionary are the two most recent dastardly supervillains featured in the MCU during Ant-Man and The Wasp, Quantumania, and the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 respectively, and both are incredibly powerful. Just like in the books, both tyrants rely on their superb intellect and advanced technology to dominate worlds and universes alike. But with that being said, I want to know who would win in a fight. Lace up your boots and tighten your gloves as I break down blow for blow who would win in a scrap between the High Evolutionary and Kang the Conqueror. Ding ding! So in order to figure out who would win in a physical altercation between these two similar but incredibly different bad guys, we should start by understanding these characters' histories and comparing any similarities that may cancel each other out. From there, we'll look at each of their notable powers and abilities and how they would affect or not affect their hypothetical foe. And of course, as we do, we will cover both the comics and the movies and see if we can't make any connections there. By the end of this video, I will reveal who would kick the other's butt in a throwdown.
You're out of your league.
So let's get on with it, shall we? Introducing first, fighting out of the red corner, wearing green with purple trim and sporting a bright blue face. Hailing from the multiverse by way of Earth 6311, Nathaniel Kang the Conqueror Richards. In the comics, Nathaniel Richards is the distant future descendant of Mr. Fantastic Reed Richards. Nathaniel is the greatest scientist that time and space has ever known and has had various incarnations over the years, and each identity has its own extensive history. Iron Lad, Ramatut, Immortus, Kid Immortus, the Scarlet Centurion, He Who Remains, and many others are all different versions of Kang. But for the sake of this video, we will focus on the main man himself, Kang the Conqueror, sometimes referred to as Prime Kang.
I am Kang!
Now, Kang doesn't possess any innate superpowers. However, he is from the 31st century and is not only a superior level engineer, but also has access to advanced and sophisticated technology and weapons. In the MCU, Kang the Conqueror has been presented exactly the same as his comic book counterpart, at least from a superpower and technological standpoint. As seen in the third Ant-Man and The Wasp movie, Kang is Nathaniel Richards and has a bunch of variants and uses science and technology as weapons and yada yada, you get it. I'll get into the nitty-gritty details of said weaponry in just a moment, but for now, let's introduce our next combatant. And now, fighting out of the blue corner, draped in crimson with metallic trim, hailing from the Citadel of Science by way of Mount Wundagore, the High Evolutionary Herbert Wyndham. In the comics, Dr. Wyndham was a brilliant Oxford-educated scientist and philosopher with an obsession for understanding the complexities of evolution. Eventually, Herbert would create and consume a serum that transformed him into the High Evolutionary. The High Evolutionary continued to study and explore the universe in search of the cosmic secrets of genetics, and even created his own race called New Men. The High Evolutionary and his race of New Men would then uplift animals, giving them human-level intelligence, among many other things. The High Evolutionary eventually created a parallel world called Counter-Earth in an attempt to perfect a utopian paradise. Unlike the aforementioned Kang the Conqueror, however, High Evolutionary's story was altered quite a bit for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Warning: Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 spoilers ahead. As revealed in Guardians 3, which I might add is a cinematic masterpiece, the High Evolutionary is a humanoid cyborg geneticist that has existed for hundreds of years, analyzing life across various galaxies. Seeing them all as flawed creatures, High Evolutionary created Orgocore as a front for his heinous and torturous experiments, and none of his creations satisfied him fully. What this version of the Evolutionary does have in common with his comic book counterpart is that he also created Counter-Earth and his perfect society. But as pointed out by the Guardians of the Galaxy in the film, the High Evo failed miserably. In the comics, and much like Kang, High Evolutionary depends on his supreme intellect and technology. When exposed to his evolutionary accelerator machine, High Evo can shift between godlike powers and Neanderthal-level abilities. In the movies, High Evo's accelerator machine is used to evolve his abused creations millions of years in an instance, and his powers are more along the lines of biotechnological advancements and upgrades. So what I'm about to do now is compare the powers and abilities that Kang and Evo both share in the comics, and then do the same for the MCU, and then see who edges who out in each regard based off of what we've seen from both villains. Now, the one thing the Evolutionary and the Conqueror have in common in the books is that they both derive the majority of their power and are protected by their armor and exoskeletons. Kang's armor is produced from a rare 40th century synthetic alloy and functions neurokinetically. That means it responds to subconscious thoughts. Duh. The Evolutionary's exoskeleton, on the other hand, provides its wearer with near-perfect defense against all physical attacks, and exceptional protection from energy, psionic, and magical attacks. Now in the MCU, and what will be a reoccurring theme with most things mentioned throughout this video, Kang's armor works identically to his pencil and inked counterparts, whereas High Evolutionary's exoskeletons do not. A good example of this would be how Kang's armor in both the comics and movies works subconsciously and can absorb energy attacks, which is great for defensive tactics. On the other hand, High Evo's automatic defense system, capable of deflecting nearly any and all physical blows from the comics, are nowhere to be found in this one and only film appearance. In the comics, Evolutionary's exoskeleton also has a life support system that provides him nourishment and can create a whole new body, or even restore Wyndham's life in the event of death. In Guardians 3, well, let's just say High Evolutionary stops evolving altogether by the end of the movie. He dies. Anyhow, it's safe to say that in the comic books, High Evolutionary's exoskeleton is much better than Kang's armor, simply for the fact it renders its wearer virtually immortal. However, in the MCU, Kang's armor is infinitely more powerful and functional on a combative level, giving Kang the edge in that regard. Moving along, both supervillains in the MCU and the books possess your typical list of enhanced physiological abilities. Superhuman strength, speed, reflexes, endurance, longevity, intelligence, and the ability to create force fields and concussive energy blasts are present in both Kang and the High Evo. Both men are capable of levitation or flying, or whatever you want to call it. That being said, both versions of Kang the Conqueror are far superior to both versions of High Evolutionary when it comes to marksmanship and hand-to-hand combat. For the most part, the High Evo would rely on the muscle and sheer numbers of his creations and henchmen, whereas Kang could probably wipe out a few waves of them on his own before needing to escape. So with that being said, when boiling it down to a straight up fistfight or shootout, Kang wins 10 out of 10 times in my opinion.
But you thought you could win.
In the MCU, both villains have their own armies, but the High Evolutionaries was much more even-keeled and went on to turn on their leader. In contrast, Kang's Quantum Realm soldiers were willing and ready to fight and die on a whim for theirs. So Kang's army is definitely more badass, but that's neither here nor there. As we continue breaking down this tale of the tape, it's time to go over the meat of the matter, and highlight the key differences between these two nefarious sociopaths, which will surely give us a better idea of who would ultimately win in a fight. As I mentioned earlier, Kang is capable of absorbing energy blasts and is also capable of dishing them back out. In Guardians 3, we saw High Evolutionary use some sort of telepathic powers that he can use to throw people around and even rip giant concrete walls off of buildings. Now that is really cool and all, but Kang would be able to break or blast through that garbage with ease. That being said, in the comics, High Evolutionary possesses mass manipulation abilities, meaning he can shrink or grow hundreds of feet, which could help nullify some of Kang's weapons and striking skills. But in the movies, that ability was absolutely nowhere to be seen. So again, this is all starting to boil down to which version of which villain we are talking about here. Now I know what you're thinking, couldn't Kang just travel around time over and over again until he figures out how to defeat the High Evolutionary? Well, that would be easier said than done in the comics. As I said before, the High Evo is nigh invincible on the page. In the movies though, all Kang would have to do is find a timeline where the Guardians of the Galaxy show up and the job would be done for him. Joking aside, creating entire planets and civilizations is now quote-unquote power to wag a finger at. But that being said, Kang has shown he can destroy entire planets and universes, with minimal resistance in most cases. Comic book High Evolutionary also ascends to god tier power levels, as I touched on earlier, where your boy Kang has been smacked around one-on-one by Spider-Man, Black Knight, the Fantastic Four, and many others. That being said, in the flick, the High Evolutionary gets his butt whooped a couple of times before being killed off completely by the end of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Kang the Conqueror, on the other hand, is being presented as the next big bad, or Thanos-level threat, of the entirety of the MCU during phases 4 through 6. So, who would win? As I'm sure you've gathered by the information I've divulged thus far in this video, and as I mentioned a little earlier on, it all really depends on which version of which villain we are talking about. But even though that's the case, the victors in both the books and the movies are quite clear. When it comes to Marvel Comics, the High Evolutionary is basically unkillable, if that's even a word, and could probably defeat Kang a bunch of times over. Although you can't count Kang out entirely, as he has figured out ways to conquer planets and galaxies before. His luck with gods, however, not so much. In the movies, Kang absolutely washes the High Evolutionary. In fact, I'm convinced Howard the Duck could probably have pulled off defeating High Evo if he really set his mind to it in the MCU. But that's not what made High Evolutionary such a memorable and sinister villain in Guardians 3, who I have to admit was much more compelling than Kang was in Ant-Man 3. All in all, the biggest difference between these two villains is that the High Evolutionary is more interested in cultivating life, whereas Kang is more interested in seeing it end. So in conclusion, my money's on the Conqueror, and for that, MCU Kang gets the clear victory over High Evolutionary, and the overall win in our fantasy dream matchup. And there you have it. That's who would win between the High Evolutionary and Kang the Conqueror in a fight. Am I wrong? I'm sure some of you think so tell me why in the comments section. And while you're down there, be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons and enable notifications so you don't miss any combative comic content.